everyone. I'm Maggie Williams, Director of the Institute of Politics here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and welcome to the JFK Junior Forum. There is not a month that goes by that our IOP Forum Director, Carrie Devine, has not been cornered by students, implored by staff, or beseeched by faculty to bring Ta-Nehisi Coates to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. Yeah, I know. We want to thank tonight's moderator, Dr. Bruce Western, for all he did to make this evening possible. Dr. Western is the director of the Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy. The center's research portfolio spans critical social policy topics, including joblessness, criminal justice, education, immigration, labor, and health policy. He is the faculty chair of the program in criminal justice and management, as well as the Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Western is also considered the leading expert on the effects of mass incarceration on the poor, and is the author of Punishment and Inequality in America, considered a classic in the field. We welcome Dr. Western to the forum as moderator of tonight's conversation. The Institute of Politics is proud to recognize our co-sponsors for this evening: the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, the Harvard Black Men's Forum, the HKS Black Student Union, and the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, the HKS Office for Student Diversity and Inclusion, and the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. Ta-Nehisi Coates is already a historical figure. His intellectual courage, yes, his intellectual courage inspires us, and it makes us all brave. Who else but Coates dare make a compelling argument for reparations just last year? Who else but Coates dare think the unthinkable and spill it out in language so powerful that we come to think of his words as dynamite? Albert Camus said that always go too far, because that is where the truth is. We are grateful that Mr. Coates has been willing to go too far. He has been willing to go too far as a national correspondent for The Atlantic, and as a journalist writing for the Village Voice, the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Monthly, and the Washington City Paper. Mr. Coates is a MacArthur Genius, Kirkus and Hillman Prize winner, National Book Award nominee, and has won the George Polk and National Magazine Awards. He is the author of 2 books, Beautiful Struggle, about his father, and Between the World and Me, a letter to his son. Please welcome Bruce Western and Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is quite a turnout. I think we have a full house tonight, which is a remarkable thing. And I know in the lottery for the distribution of tickets, I think 1 in 5 were able to be with us this evening, but we're live streaming. And I know the audience is very much larger than that. So welcome, everyone, to this conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates. This event was organised by the Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy with the John F. Kennedy Forum. I'm very grateful to Barbara Whalen and April Austin at the Malcolm Wiener Center for all their efforts in putting this event together. So we're going to begin today by speaking with Ta-Nehisi. And as Maggie was saying, Ta-Nehisi writes for the Atlantic, and he's authored a powerful series of pieces examining how our history of racial discrimination and racialized violence is imprinted on contemporary African American disadvantage. This summer, as we well know, he published a really remarkable essay, Between the World and Me, reflecting on African American life and its place in African American society, particularly in the aftermath of the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, Missouri. Ta-Nehisi's work has been widely recognised, most recently by a MacArthur Fellowship. And for me, I think he's the most exciting social and political commentator in America today. It's a thrill to have you here. Ta-Nehisi and I will talk about his work for about 35 minutes, and then I'll bring up our panellists, Professor William Julius Wilson and Professor Kathryn Edin. Bill Wilson is the Lewis P. and Linda L. Geyser University Professor at Harvard and a faculty affiliate of the Wiener Center. All I'll say about Bill, and I could introduce him at length, is that for 4 decades, he has been the towering figure in research on poverty in America. Kathryn Edin is the inaugural Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Sociology, University Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Johns Hopkins, and a dear former colleague of ours at the Kennedy School and at the Wiener Center. And through her many books and articles, Kathy has probably taught us more than anyone about the dynamics of family life in poor communities. But before we bring up Bill and Kathy, Ta-Nehisi, welcome to Harvard.
Thank you.
And let's talk a little bit about your work. So in the short period since the summer, I've thought you've made 2 really significant contributions to our understanding of the contemporary positions of African Americans in American society. Mass incarceration and the criminal justice system have been important to this assessment. So what do you mean by mass incarceration? What does this term mean to you? And what's its significance for race and racial progress today?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. My work, my own piece on mass incarceration, to some extent, even the book Between the World and Me, is, here's a phrase I never thought I would say, is indebted to Harvard. I thought I'd say that, but it's true. Last winter, Bruce, we had corresponded over email, and Bruce was nice enough to assemble, himself, Matthew Desmond, Diva Page was here, Robert Sampson, for a very, very powerful dinner. And I came up with my editor, Scott Stossel. And it's a serious, serious dinner when you come in thinking one thing about mass incarceration and the African-American family as I did at the time, and then you leave there thinking something totally different. Well, not totally, but things get a lot more complicated than you thought they were going in. So I just want to thank you guys for having me. I guess I also should say, while I'm at it, I owe your president a great debt, Drew Gilpin-Faust. Tremendous, tremendous, tremendous historian. I'm sure all of you guys already know that, but it's just important for me to say that her work is just, This Republic of Suffering, her stuff on slave mistresses during the Civil War, during the South, is really, really important, to my understanding of race in this country. So after that long preamble, I'm going to try to remember the question. I think I remember now. Okay. So I think, it is... It's funny to have to answer that question from you, what mass incarceration is, but I'll go ahead and give it a shot. I think just on a numbers basis, and I know you guys already know this, we are at a level of incarceration in our country that is both historically different and geographically different in terms of the rest of the world. So we incarcerate roughly 700 per 100,000 people. In 1970, our incarceration rate was about 160 per 100,000 people, just to give you, some sense of the expanse of that. Our next nearest competitor is Russia, which is at about 450 per 100,000. It's not even close. China has roughly 4 times the population of the United States. The United States has 500,000 more people in jail. The United States comprises 5% of the world's population, 25% of its incarcerated population. And then when you start looking at the numbers around race, if you start looking and a lot of this is pulled from Bruce, so it's funny to be sitting here with him, but I'm quoting his stuff back to him. When you start looking at, yeah, I know, right? As long as it's footnoted. And then, it has a particular, interest, the criminal justice system in this country and, mass incarceration specifically, It has a particular interest in African Americans. The incarceration rate for African American males is somewhere around 4,000 per 100,000. I talked about, coming to Harvard and thinking one thing and, coming out thinking something different. And one of the things I thought before I got here was I think I was pretty much within the camp that, as much as the numbers seem sort of recent, there actually are some things about the numbers that are quite old. And so, one of the things, that I realized in this then is this habit of incarcerating black people, of using the criminal justice system to deal with, ills in other communities that we would use other tools for is actually not exactly new. I was talking to a group of students earlier today and I was pointing out, and Bruce, you're going to have to help me with my citation because the citation is really important. But there's a gentleman who wrote the paper. I cited him in the article, but I'm just blanking. But he wrote a paper, and he basically pointed out that if you went to the northern cities, 1920, 1930, 1940, you would find the incarceration ratio between black and white folks to be about somewhere around 7-1. And you would find a lower ratio in the South, but that's because the South was effectively a police state. You don't need incarceration there, right? Well, 7-1 is about what our ratio is right now. And what that says to you, that even though we have like a number, in terms of just, the raw number is larger, the habit of really using incarceration, using the criminal justice system to deal with social problems is not particularly new. And whose paper was that?
Chris Muller.
Thank you. Thank you. This is like when you write this stuff, you have to digest it, and it just, you kind of, sometimes even as you cite the names in your work, you lose the names when it's time to talk. So sorry about that, Chris.
Who's here, actually?
Oh, really? I'm really sorry. Hi. It's a great paper, sir.
And so you got this enormous racial disparity, and you got these really high rates of incarceration. Now, what's the significance of that for how we should understand American race relations?
What I got, after that, I had like a numbers thing, and after reading that paper, I had a numbers thing. There's a great deal of history in that paper about, Irish immigrants and, how they related to black folks coming up north. But if the numbers can historicize it, my job, putting the reporting portion of it aside, was to, historicize it within the American narrative. And one of the arguments I make in the piece is that you can't just find this sort of criminalization in the numbers. There's actually within the documents and within the history itself. And this is, more on the imaginative end, but I really, the politically imaginative end, but I really, really believe it's true. I believe, for instance, that it's significant that we have a fugitive slave clause in our Constitution, that black criminality is literally written into our earliest documents, that throughout the 250 years that we had slavery in this country, basically for pursuing any other normal right that folks would pursue, for black people who were enslaved to pursue it, it was effectively a criminal act. I believe in heritage. I believe that as much as George Washington matters, as much as the American Revolution matters, the heritage of telling ourselves certain things about black people also matters too. So if you have a long history of saying to yourself that black people are in fact criminals, if you follow that history up after black folks are emancipated, with 100 years of what can only really be described as a terrorist campaign, and you justify that campaign, you justify lynching, you justify extrajudicial justice through the notion of criminality. If you have somebody like Ben Pitchfork Tillman on the Senate floor, making an argument for lynching through the usage of criminality, if you have sociology, folks trying to explain the black situation and using criminality, if you have a leadership class, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, that the society effectively regards as criminals. Very, very important to understand that. I always say, people like to support Martin Luther King now. I understand that. I'm all for that. I'm glad our president cited him. I'm not arguing against that. But it's very, very important to understand how Martin Luther King was seen in his time. And in his time, he was treated by the highest powers in this country like a criminal. And I think that heritage has some sort of effect. And so when you come into the 1970s and you have, increasing crime, as we had increasing crime in other countries, as we had increasing crime in Canada, as we had increasing crime in Europe, and you ask yourself, why did America choose a particular solution that other countries then didn't? I think that heritage is really, really important.
Yeah. For me, that is one of the entirely powerful arguments of the Atlantic peace, that now we're living in a period in which the link between incarceration and crime has become entirely naturalized.
Right.
And you're able to show, no, this is a historical product of centuries of racial domination.
Yeah. And Bruce, just really quickly, I would push that, I would actually push this a little bit further, and I would say that it is also common when African Americans make demands for political rights to point to criminality as a response. I was going through Taylor Branch's first book. I mean, this isn't like the Montgomery boycott. Like the first thing they say is, oh, clearly these black folks aren't actually protesting. It's Negro thugs or toughs who are making them do it. The criminal argument is always there. We were having this discussion upstairs about, the need to talk about neighborhood violence. I believe that. We can get into that. I very much believe that we as thinkers and intellectuals do need to talk about that. But I think it's also important to point out that in this time, when folks are very, very concerned about police violence, that the answer is yes, but what about crime over there? What about crime in the neighborhood? And I think it's very, very important to point out that that is not a new response. That is actually a very, very old response.
What's the effect of it, do you think, subjectively, right, to live in a world in which you're suspect, in which your criminality is sort of officially recognised in public policy? What's the consequence of that, do you reckon?
Well, I'm just thinking about myself, and I'm thinking about something that I caught myself doing the other day, and I realized that I do all the time. I was exiting somewhere, and there was a white woman ahead of me, and we were basically headed in the same direction. And I waited to let her get far, far ahead of me, so that she didn't think like I was like following her or anything. And I thought, damn, I do that all the time. Like that's something I actually do. She didn't look at me any kind of way, or there was nothing that she did that would make me think. But I made the assumption myself that she would think that. Who knows what she was actually thinking? I say that to say that I think it's a kind of weight. I think it's a serious, serious weight. And I think, one of the things I tried to get at in the book is like when you're black, you're always like switching the language that you're talking. So I'm on the block and I have to address people one kind of way in order to protect myself, and then I'm not on the block and I have to address, modulate myself in a different way, so that people understand that I'm intelligent, that I'm a citizen, that I'm a decent person. Yeah. Police officers approach and I have to modulate myself in a different way that other citizens in this society do not. I can remember when I was working as a young reporter at DC and a guy once told me about how he was another reporter about how the cops had pulled him over and he had cursed out the cop. And I said, you did what? I said, you did what? But people do this. I mean, in other worlds, you know what I mean? There are other worlds where people address police departments in different kind of ways, So there's this constant, I think, so I'm saying that the whole criminality piece is just one thing. It's just another thing, that you have to deal with as you modulate yourself. And I obviously worry about that a great deal with my son,
Do you want to, you got to say something more about that?
Yeah. Well, one of the arguments I make in Between the World and Me is that much of what people look at in Black America and construe as anger is in fact deep, deep fear. That much of what I saw in Black America as a young person and construed as anger and as hardness, as toughness was in fact deep, deep fear. That goes for my parents, who were tough. That goes for the boys that I walked to school with. That goes for the girls. That goes for everybody. I knew, and this was a massive, massive realization for me. I didn't understand that at the time. I myself knew that I was afraid, but I thought everybody else knew something that I didn't know, and then to realize that they actually didn't. They in fact themselves were afraid. And it's one thing to realize that for yourself, but see, then you have a child. Child comes into the world. And that's all you have, right? That really, who knows that, one day you'll be here, in such illustrious company. I had a child when I was 24 years old, right? And all I knew was that if I could do a good job at this, I might actually be a decent person. All parents are afraid. All parents, black, white, whatever, you're all afraid. But black parents are really, really afraid in a different and a particular way. And I think a lot of that has to do with the kind of modulation you have to do throughout your life to hopefully do something to protect your body, So that's been huge for me over the years. It has been, we have had numerous conversations over and over and over and over again from as long as the boy could talk. Yeah.
There's a thread that runs through between the world and me. So much of your writing about the insecurity of black bodies. Another thread that runs through your work is just the salience of poverty in so much of African American life. And I've sort of been thinking a lot about these two themes in your work, violence and poverty.
Right.
And what connection do you see between those things in African American life?
Well, I'll be interested in what our co-panelists have to say, because I think my observation is an on-the-ground one. I individually did not grow up particularly poor, and I definitely did not grow up in a I guess on paper it would have looked like a broke-down family, but it didn't. My dad has 7 kids by 4 different women, and that looks a kind of way to sociologists. But my perception was not that. I was in contact with all of my brothers and sisters. My dad was very much a father. Everybody, knew who was whose mother and who was who. It looked very organized to me, in fact. It did not look, I just thought, And in fact, what I compared it to was everybody else I knew in the neighborhood, the vast majority of them who did not have a father. So I actually thought, we were stable. That was my, understanding of it. But I was born in a neighborhood, right? And I was, born in a neighborhood where people did not have certain things. I was born, in a neighborhood, that had been shaped by the housing policies of Baltimore City. Baltimore City is a city that at one time they tried to actually have racial zoning until the Supreme Court struck it down. My mother grew up in the very, very same projects where Freddie Gray died. My grandmother, and I didn't learn this until I published the case for reparations, had herself taken out a contract loan to buy her, her home. Did not actually own the home outright until many, many years later, well into my lifetime. So this was a community that was shaped by those forces. My middle schools particularly was really, really violent. That's what I remember it most. That's what I remember having to go through, the rituals. And I don't think you can separate the amount of violence from, to use Rob's terminology, from the deprivation. I just don't, which, compounded across generations and was concentrated into one area, because I was very aware that if I went over to Mount Washington, if I went over to Roland Park, if I cut on the TV and saw how the rest of the country lived, see, they didn't live that way. I didn't have the history at the time. Looking back on it now, what I would have understood is that those neighborhoods had not suffered, those people had not suffered in that same sort of way. And so I can remember being young, and so much of the violence being about proving to other people that, as we used to say, that you were hard, which is to say that you would not be made a target, that you yourself could not have violence put upon you, which, I have to say, we have this sort of conversation about, a culture of poverty, a culture of violence. You can call that a culture. I have no problem with that. But within the context, it made a lot of sense to me, and it makes a lot of sense to me now. So I think you can't really separate that kind of pose, which I certainly participated in. And this goes back to, again, talking to your kid, right? Like your kid has to be one way or feels like he has to be one way on the street, but yet, and I was very, very, very determined about this, that your kid has to, go see other things. And that kind of way that he's going to be in one environment does not work in another environment.
Is incarceration and rough handling by police and intrusive forms of policing, is that violence in the same way, or?
I think ultimately, yeah. I think that the method of distribution is different. You know what I mean? But I think ultimately, when I think about, like, again, the violence in the community I grew up in, it's very, very hard for me to separate that from policy. And when I think about why Freddie Gray was killed, it's very, very hard for me to separate that from policy. Just to take the police example, having already talked about the housing and education in the schools in Baltimore. Freddie Gray, this is the case as it was reported. Freddie Gray makes eye contact with a police officer. He looks suspicious to the police officer and he runs. And this is an arrestable offense, right? In Gilmore Homes. But it's not an arrestable offense on the Upper East Side to look at somebody a certain way and run. And it's not an arrestable offense because we determined that that's an area of high drug traffic. And we've decided that certain things will be arrestable that will not be arrestable in other areas. Is that smart? What are we actually pursuing there? I'm not clear. And so I think as Americans, we make certain decisions about policy that don't seem obviously violent. That don't, in the immediate term, it's not us saying, listen, we're gonna go in and do X, Y, and Z to these folks. We're gonna go kick in doors. But in fact, ultimately have to have violence as the outcome. Yeah. I think about that young lady in the school. Just a few weeks ago, was flipped over and dragged, across the floor, right? Well, is the officer there because they said they, are going to deal with children in that school, through violence? Probably not. They're probably there, to prevent violence, if anything. In fact, I think some of the students, a buddy of mine was telling me, some of the students actually organized a protest in his support. And they said because when fights break out, there's the guy, breaks the stuff up. But maybe there's a series of questions that came way before you even got to the officer that should be asked. Yeah. Maybe by the time you get the officer in the classroom, maybe by the time you even get the officer in the school, like you're way too late, you're far gone. And we accept it. And so we begin our debates with, should the officer have done X, Y, and Z, as opposed to why he was in school in the first place. We begin our debates the same thing in the neighborhood. Why are these kids acting a certain way? But maybe 5 things happened before we even got there. Right. And I think if it's anything I'm trying to do in my work is get us to think in that sort of way. Yeah,
so let me sort of go there. And so I think often what you're pushing on is a different concept of justice. Ultimately, you've given us a social analysis in which contemporary inequalities and disadvantage historically produced, in which public policy, political forces are front and centre, and the patterns of inequality that we see are very much the product of political choices. And this compels us, I think, this is what I read in your work, to think about justice in a different way. It puts things like reparations on the table. As we think about the massive problem of mass incarceration, what does justice look like in the face of mass incarceration?
Wow. Well, let's go back to like your question about justice. One of my great frustrations early in my career, before I became a writer, was that it just felt like when we were talking about problems, the conversation was attenuated. We had a point that we began, and then there was a point that we ended. So if it was urban policy, we basically, Watts was the beginning of history. And everything that happened before then felt like cut off. And I hope to, and it's not just me, obviously, a number of historians and sociologists doing this work, but just open it up, a little bit more, so that we can see history as a longer process. Reparations for me fits into that, because if you just study, black folks and you ask yourself, well, what happened since the 60s? If you see that as a massive breaking point, then the claim becomes harder, and you get into all these other discussions that I think we've been, caught up in. But if you open the window, if you can see like the country as an entity in and of itself, it does not die with each individual generation, and we know that to be true in any other area of our policy. If that were not true, we wouldn't be able to collect taxes, we wouldn't be able to enforce treaties, we wouldn't be able to do anything. We wouldn't be a state if the country were not an entity. And you ask yourself, well, what has that entity's policy been towards black people since they arrived on these shores? And it doesn't look good. Doesn't look good. It doesn't look good. I mean, even if you say, well, last 50 years, we tried to kind of do the right thing. Well, I mean, you got a lot of history before that, to do. And one of the cases I make, in my own journalism, that, the preeminent way to understand it, as far as I'm concerned, is plunder. That has been the relationship between African Americans and their country. That is what enslavement ultimately is. It is taking things from people. That lynching was not simply done just to be mean to people, but to enforce certain, norms that enriched, other people. That when you deprive people of the right to vote, when you deprive people of the right to have a say in their governance, and you still tax them, and you still tell them that they have to, hold up their end of the social contract, that you are taking from them. That too is plunder. That if you tax people and you build segregated schools that they can't attend, and you build segregated pools that they can't swim in, and segregated public university systems that they can't attend, that you are in fact taking from them. That's what the policy is. That if you have a housing policy in this country, as we did have, that basically rests on the idea of cutting a group out. That you have social programs in this country, as we did have in the mid-20th century, that can only be passed by cutting a group out, that is plunder. And then if you stop doing that, or you say rhetorically that you're going to stop doing that, let's take the conservative part, say you stop doing that. And you follow that up with this policy of incarceration, which looks innocent, which looks like simply a response to crime. But if you can understand it as something that you were prone to do because of everything you did before then, I think it puts a certain weight on us. And I don't know that the weight ends simply by saying let's decarcerate. I don't know that it's enough to look at the past 40 years of policy, look at the population of people who've been bearing the brunt of that policy and say, you know what, we made a mistake. We're sorry, no harm, no foul. Or big harm, but no foul. I don't know that decarceration, which would be really, really hard in and of itself. If you talk about, returning to, 1970 levels, even controlling, accounting for population growth, I think that's going to be really, really hard in and of itself. But what's the program? I mean, do you just send folks back into the communities that are already struggling in and of themselves? I mean, what are we supposed to do about the last 40 years, though? That happened. That doesn't even seem to be on the table. Yeah. And I don't even know that serious decarceration is on the table. But then there's a conversation even after that is not. And so reparations for me, it's to push the idea. It is not enough to just stop wounding someone. That you actually have to heal someone. You actually have to do something about the harm that you've produced. It's not enough to simply say, I've stopped harming. We wouldn't accept that in any other, sort of exchange between, groups of people or individuals. I don't know why we accept it as an exchange between our society and African Americans.
I think it's a really challenging idea for a school of public policy, right? Because for us,
you don't think the president's going to come out for reparations? You don't believe it's going to happen?
Could happen. I mean,
I'm stunned.
But I think for this room, right, frequently our response to bad public policy is improving public policy. Right. But of course, that doesn't speak to the challenges of historic injustices, and it doesn't make right the past. And I think within our domestic policies, I'm not sure we have great models for that, right? I think looking internationally in the field of human rights, truth and reconciliation processes, official apology, Nuremberg after World War II. I mean, these were...
But those are usually after massive social upheaval, something has happened to compel the society to do something, which is even more depressing.
Yeah, the product of vast political will at a time of crisis.
Right. It's rarely because I can't think of a case when it's been like moral improvement, like we just decide we're going to be better. I don't know that to exist in history, but we say we're exceptional, so maybe. That's what we say, right? We say we're exceptional.
I had a question down here about your pessimism, and
I'm not pessimistic. You guys are naive. I'm not pessimistic. Not you, Bruce.
But I want to invite our other panelists up onto the stage now. So, Kathy and Bill, if you could join us.
Am I standing?
So we've talked a bit among ourselves about how we should respond to Ta-Nehisi's analysis of contemporary urban poverty, race in America as it is today. Bill, if I could turn to you first. What's your reaction to the conversation we've been having so far?
I think it's a very interesting conversation, and I would like to see if I can put things in a slightly different context, but relate my comments to what you and Ta-Nehisi discussed. When you were talking about your background, somewhat middle-class background, I was thinking that, sometimes we forget that African Americans are not a monolithic socioeconomic group. And I recently read a report by Kendra Bischoff and Sean Reardon, which was prepared for the Russell Sage Foundation. And they pointed out that whereas African American families in 1970 recorded the least income segregation among racial and ethnic groups in metropolitan areas of at least 500,000 residents. Today, believe it or not, they have the highest income segregation, which is driven in part by the sharp increase in concentrated black poverty and the rapid rise in the black middle class since 2000. Now, please understand that I'm talking about residential segregation among black families of different income levels, not segregation between black families and white families. And another way, sort of talking about these trend lines is that they describe the extent to which exposure of families of neighbors of the same race has changed over time. And I really want to highlight this point. Poor African Americans today have much fewer middle-class neighbors than they did in 1970. And when income segregation is coupled with racial segregation, poor blacks cluster in neighborhoods that feature disadvantages over several dimensions. Joblessness, educational attainment, family breakups, and crime. So since we've been talking here about crime, just take the crime is one of these dimensions. We were talking about poverty and crime. In 1978, poor blacks aged 12 and over were only marginally more likely than affluent blacks to be victims of violent crime. Roughly 45 and 38 per 1,000 individuals, respectively. By 2008, that has changed significantly to poor blacks 75 per 1,000 victims of violent crime, affluent blacks down to 23 per 1,000. And violent crime can reach extraordinary levels in some of the poorest black neighborhoods. Take, for example, Milwaukee, where 46% of African Americans live in high poverty neighborhoods. That is, neighborhoods with poverty rates of at least 40%. So in Milwaukee, a black person is 20 times more likely than a white person to be shot and 9 times more likely to be murdered. Now, many of these incidents involve gang fights, but they also reveal, I think if you did a close analysis, it would reveal that a number of the victims were innocent. Now, many of these poor inner city neighborhoods, sort of putting things in context, relating back to some of Ta-Nehishi's comments. You got to put this in context. Not only feature increasing and prolonged joblessness, but they're also characterized by a dwindling number of non-poor families and depopulation. You know, I think about HBO's The Wire. David Simon did a brilliant job of capturing depopulation, vacant lots, abandoned buildings, and so on, making it much more difficult to sustain, you know, the basic institutions in these neighborhoods or to achieve what Rob Sampson would call adequate levels of social organization. Now, this results in a weak institutional resource base. You know, Rob, when I wrote When Work Disappears, this is you probably don't remember, but you said, you raised this issue about a weak institutional resource base. You see, it's easier for parents to control the behavior of their children when a strong institutional resource base exists. When the links between community organizations, civic clubs, political organizations, schools, churches, and so on are stable and strong. The higher the density and stability of formal organizations, the less illicit activity, such as drug trafficking, crime, prostitution, and gang formation can take a root in the neighborhood. Now, neighborhoods, however, that feature a weak institutional resource base, parents in these neighborhoods have a much more difficult time of raising their children, much more difficult time of controlling the behavior of adolescents, preventing them from getting involved in activities that are detrimental to pro-social development. And we should appreciate that these parents live under constraints that people in the broader society don't realize or can't even imagine. And I wish there was greater awareness and appreciation, especially among national policymakers, about their plight, the ordeals that they experience. And this leads into public policy discussions, which we could talk about later.
Fantastic. And Kathy, where's the family? Bill's spoken to us about neighbourhoods, the structure of neighbourhoods, the institutional landscape that characterises neighbourhoods. Where's the family in this story?
So one of the ways that this disadvantage is manifest, as the essay in The Atlantic points out, is really in the family. And I'm going to start with the family, but I'm going to end with incarceration. So bear with me for a moment, because when we think about the black family, we often think of the single-parent family. And I'm going to try to convince you in just a few minutes that there are no single-parent families. Things are much more complex. And actually getting a more realistic idea about what's happening to low-income families more generally, black, white, and Latino, because single parenthood is now not solely an African-American issue, but its main growth is among whites and Latinos. Getting that more in-depth, accurate understanding of what's going on in the family can help us think a lot better about how we might address the unique needs and assets of these families. So we began with this claim, there are no single mothers. So recently, family demography has revealed that when a young woman comes to the hospital who is unmarried and gives birth, if you interview her or her partner at the time of the birth, about 80% of the time it turns out that this couple is in a romantic relationship. About half the time, the couple is actually living together in a family relationship. And in fact, we know that virtually all of the growth in single parenthood recently has been due to a rise in cohabiting relationships. But we also know that there are very, very high rates of disillusion even among these cohabiting couples. By the time these unmarried children reach the age of 5, only about 30 are in stable families. And we also know that particularly in the United States context, there's rapid repartnering and subsequent childbearing. So Americans love to get together, and they love to break up, and they love to get together again. So when you put all of this together and you look at this portrait from a child's point of view, okay, and these are unmarried children, only 4% of children spend the first 5 years of their lives in a stably single family household. And I think this is really profound because in some ways we've sort of unfairly blamed the single mother, right? Because we've thought about the counterfactual of the two-parent married family as the stably single mother. And we've kind of blamed the differences between children raised in single mother families and two-parent families on the single mother. So if they're not single mothers, then what are they? So the next thing I want to convince you of is that these are actually complex, unstable families. I've been trying to convince physicians of this. You know, they actually think the family is the mother and child. They have maternal and child. My department in the School of Public Health at Hopkins used to be called the Department of Child and Maternal Health, as if men didn't matter. But men are everywhere in these families, not just Ta-Nehisi's family. So when a single parent family presents itself, think to yourself, aha, this is probably actually a complex, unstable family. And in fact, the rates of instability and complexity are so great, and the family forms that result, and again, this is not just among African Americans, but they're disproportionately represented, is now I wish I had a table to show you, as a, kind of a stick figure, a set of images to show you what these families look like. That it becomes hard to imagine how parents and children really navigate all of these complex relationships. And I will say that we know from demographers that these rates in the United States are historically unique. The United States has not been like this before. And we are also unique as among our rich nations, our other counterparts. So we may look a little bit like Latvia, but we don't look like the rest of the developed world. Now, you may say to yourself, so what? And I think that's a very good question to ask. We should always be questioning our assumptions that things are good and bad. So in order to answer that question, we need to ask how families are faring. And here, the literature that's emerging is quite troubling. So it turns out that kids are really resilient. In the face of parental divorce, they often adapt. What's really consequential is the rate of change. And what we're seeing increasingly is that the rate of change is so rapid that kids are having trouble adjusting, and that the rate of transition and the speed of transition ends up being highly consequential for children, particularly boys. Dads, too, are not faring very well. They're ending up having their children across multiple partners more often than not. David Williams, one of the dads we interviewed in Philadelphia, he had a beautiful relationship with the mother of his youngest child. He describes the birth of this baby who came out of his mother's womb spinning like a bullet, in his words, as one of the most beautiful moments of his life. He works selling newspapers at the base of the Ben Franklin Bridge, one of the toughest and most degraded jobs you can have. And yet he brings his money home, gives it to his partner Deborah, and delights in parenting both his child and his partner's two children, whose biological father is incarcerated. So he looks like a fabulous dad, right? But it turns out he has 4 other children, 2 by a woman who, when he was incarcerated, simply left town, leaving no forwarding address, and this is not uncommon. And 2 others that he was also separated from quite young when he was also incarcerated, who he's really not got much of a relationship with at all. So many men are very much like David Williams. They end up fathering in a serial selective fashion. And in fact, if you look at the NLSY, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, what you see is that though 85% of men who ever had a non-marital birth are actively parenting at least one of their children on a weekly or daily basis, 50% have also left another child completely behind, of men who've had children by more than one woman. So you have a lot of strain in the family, and what this does to men, of course, it puts them on a family go-round where they don't get to parent all of their children well, and it puts children on a father go-round where many of them will have no adult that stays with them for the life course and is there long enough to pay the college tuition bill or even to attend the high school graduation. Finally, though, I want to say that all policy is family policy. I did learn a thing or two during my 7 years here. I taught a class called Poverty and Social Policy that I loved. And in that class, we talked about the fact that direct interventions into the family have not worked very well, right? But indirect interventions show dramatic results. Everything from preschool, high-quality preschool interventions, to high school interventions, to wage subsidies for working welfare recipients have shown dramatic increases in the probability that men will be living with their children and their children's mother in stable 2-parent homes, even 40 years. You know, in the case of Prairie Preschool, the results are 40 years out. And what this signals to us is that if we improve our basic institutions, preschool, high school, offering people a modest living wage, we can do a lot to restore the family. And in fact, in some work that I'm going to talk about in a minute, we also have the power to do the opposite. But it's certainly not that family fragility is inevitable. But to end on a depressing note, since we are talking about mass incarceration, I do want to talk about the fact that incarceration is a policy approach that we have quite a lot of evidence now that it's done the opposite. We have evidence that it's really tearing the fabric of these relationships apart. Note that each of David Williams' parenting attempts were interrupted by a spell of incarceration that led to a disengagement between him and his children. And we see this in quantitative data as well. In fact, in a paper that Bruce published, I don't know if you remember this paper, in 2004 with Sarah McClanahan and Len Lopo, they find that among high school dropouts, the least educated men in their sample, that if they, it's kind of a fancy paper, it has some imputations, but if you assume a zero incarceration model, society, you could cut the marriage gap between African Americans and whites in half. So although incarceration there's evidence that it's really deleterious to the family, there's also hope that if we continue to work and move on this margin, we can improve things dramatically.
So, terrific comments, and I want to turn to Ta-Nehisi quickly before opening the floor, and I see a bunch of continuities between Bill's and Kathy's comments with the conversation we started with. I don't want to load the dice though. Where do you how do you relate our initial conversation to the neighbourhoods that Bill was talking about, to the families that Kathy was describing?
You know what, I'm going to pass on that question. And I just want to process, because I actually just took in a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I have an intelligent response yet. I have like very initial, poorly formed. I haven't seen Bill's research, so I was very excited to hear it. I can't read the paper. So I'm just pulling in a lot right now. I don't want to just come on my face and say something stupid. So. Also, we get more Q&A.
Yeah. So that's an invitation to the floor then, and we're going to open up the discussion to you. I want to ask each of you, when you ask a question, to do three things. Could you please identify yourself? Could you ask one brief question, please? No speeches. And the really characteristic thing of a question is that it ends in a question mark. And I would urge you in the strongest terms to pose a question to the panel.
Absolutely. My name is Trevor Brand-Seraph, college class of 2015. And my question is I think, pretty quick. It seems like there's a divide between the mass popularity among a lot of the left who very much identify with Black Lives Matter, with Ta-Nehisi Coates' writing, and with this being an issue that matters. There seems to be a divide between their awareness of it as an issue and their openness/willingness to embrace policy moves that would actually start making a difference, that are sometimes hard to do, let alone have the political will to really push them through. And I'm curious what your reactions are to that kind of divide and how you guys think about pushing that divide.
Well, I don't know that there's that is where the divide. I mean, it's not like if you got to convince the whole country. I think therein is the divide. I think it's very, very hard. I mean, and I was just thinking as I was listening to my two esteemed commenters here, whether I was like stressing race too much, because there are always these other sort of dimensions that you can look at the problem by, and yet. I can't escape, from the fact that I think that one of the problems is to have, the kind of differing policy that you would need. I think part of that really, really involves looking at black people in a different way. There was a story just a week or so ago, a week and a half ago, front page of the New York Times, this alarming heroin rise among white people. White people are using heroin at alarming rates. Well, I remember the crack era. And I remember the response. And my recollection, I was only 10 years old, but my recollection, at least, is that the response was not that it was very, very different. And so I say this to say that I don't know that, even as, we talk about, as we focus on, these sort of, very, very important categories, poverty is very, very, very important, obviously. The trends that Kathy is talking about here are not just among Black people, and yet sometimes, and I have no way of proving this, that this way of seeing Black folks, in a certain way, that when, the president is, for instance, pushing for health care at the time, the immediate, notion that this is reparations. I would have liked reparations, but that wouldn't have been it. I mean, that wouldn't have been what I would have called reparations. I have no problem with reparations, but that's not what I would have called it. But the immediate thought that this is some sort of giveaway to Black people, the instinct to see a young girl flipped over in a chair, dragged across the floor, I said this like 5 times a day, but to immediately ask, what did she do? Yeah. As opposed to, hey, I wouldn't want that done to my daughter. Like, I wonder if we can separate that out, So I think it's beyond the level. I think that, like, you have to get a critical mass of people in this country to see Black people differently, to put it straight. I don't know how you do that.
Good evening. My name is Monica Cost, and I finished reading your book, Between the World and Me, about 2 weeks ago on an airplane. And had I known I was going to have the response I had, I probably would have waited till I got home. I cried for about 40 minutes. Oh. And I'm still happy that I read it, but I'm raising 2 little Black boys. And so, I take it this is your first time interacting and talking to your son about these issues, and I'm just wondering, based upon the information that you've given him and how much you talk to him about it, do you recommend that, or do you feel like you've said too much, or do you feel like you haven't said enough? I'm just curious on a personal level how that's going.
I have no recommendation for how people should interact with their kids based on that book, because that's not my son's first time seeing that. It's a literary form that I chose. We've been having those conversations for years.
Yes, no, I was more saying how you felt about what you've been saying to your child.
Oh, how do I feel?
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like I, would rather burden him with the information than to have him go out in the world and get, punched in the face by it. I'd rather prepare him.
Hello, my name is Chuck.
Oh, right, yeah. Oh, and there too.
Oh, God, sorry.
Mr. Coates, my name is Yvonne Baptiste. I'm a second year here at the Kennedy School. One of the things that struck me the most about reading Between the World and Me was your statement that, as I think sort of a coping mechanism, African Americans have almost romanticized slavery in a way, because we see ourselves as the redemption, the hope of those who suffered through slavery, something that you suggest in your book that your son should not do. Right. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about that, and whether or not you wrote that because you think, because rightfully so, sacrifice implies a choice, and if that's not the case, then why choose those particular words?
Well, I didn't do that, but that's interesting. That is, no, I'm serious. That's a reading. No, it's a perfectly credible and very, very interesting reading. I think it comes out of 2 places. It comes out of like my atheism. And so I think if you have a belief in a divine power and some sort of continuance in an afterlife, and the idea that in some sort of way, as we tend to say that folks are looking down on you, then it becomes a little easier, in fact, perhaps necessary to think that way. I have a hard time doing that myself, I think that we had 250 years of enslavement in this country, and I think what that meant was that individual Black people died, and that was all they knew. They were born into slavery, and then, it ended with slavery, and their kids and grandkids for generations, and their parents and grandparents for generations before them experienced the same thing as individuals. And I don't want to anesthetize that by making it into a mass of people who somehow sacrificed for me, because as you allude to, they never should have had to sacrifice to begin with. That should never be forgotten. You know, and I think like there's a tendency, you know, especially, you know, as we talk about progress that, you know, is very real, that's happened in this country, to, you know, congratulate ourselves. But see, it was wrong. It was wrong to begin with, you know, from jump, it was wrong. And so we're pulling ourselves up out of the wrong. It's good, happy to see it, but it still was wrong, you know. And I think like these folks didn't ask to be your martyrs. They didn't ask for that. They asked to be free, and they didn't get that. And I think like one should be very, very careful about deriving pleasure. Well, let me say that more fairly. One should be very careful about deriving one's individual destiny. The notion that somehow, you know, one gets to enjoy freedoms because these people suffered. They didn't ask to suffer. I just think that's really, really, really important to remember.
Hi, Mr. Coates. Thank you so much for speaking today. I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School, and I wanted to ask what you think about the protests that are happening at Yale right now. And Missouri. And other campuses. The reason I specifically mention Yale is because I'm curious what you think about how to challenge institutions that perpetuate race, but whether the protests that are going on right now are closing an honest conversation or opening it up.
Well, I highly doubt they're closing it, because that would presume that there was something there, and I wonder if it was there to begin with. Having said that, I swear to God, I'm not trying to duck your question. I have been on book tour for 7 weeks now. I'm not even clear what they're protesting over. Do you know that? Like, I just haven't got, I know what the inciting incident was. I know about the Halloween letter, but I suspect that, again, as I was saying to Bruce, that it's about 5 other things behind that. And I don't know those 5 other things. Do you understand? I'm just not up on you know, the situation like that well enough to know. So I would be hesitant to critique them on that. Yeah.
It's okay. My name is China Boak-Terrell, and I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I'll just throw a few questions out there. Given that you're a Baltimore native, number 1, are the right people running for mayor in Baltimore?
That's for you. You don't answer that question.
Number 2, for the Freddie Grays who are out there that are already at the age that we are, is there a generation that we have to give up on? Like, is there anything that can be done to bring them back from, well, what they're about to experience if things don't change, literacy, job, records, that kind of a thing? Third, now that, they're short questions, but now that you and your family are in France, I'm really curious to know, what are you discovering about race relations there? Because I think I used to live in Lyon, France, and I think it's amazing that France was such a haven for the literary greats, the Harlem Renaissance folks, all these people. But now when you go, you see brown people, basically security guards at department stores. And they haven't been able to progress much beyond that. So there you go, they're my questions.
How about you answer the Baltimore question?
The Baltimore question.
Because I haven't lived in Baltimore. I've never lived there as an adult. That's the thing you should know. I was born there. No, I mean,
okay.
I don't even know who's running, literally. You know, I
okay.
can't answer.
It's a crowded field.
Sheila Dixon
Whether
and
there's
Nick,
the right
Marilyn
person yet.
Mosby's husband, Nick Mosby.
Okay,
That's who's
all right.
running.
We're going to let a Baltimore resident get at it, though.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a crowded field. Yeah, so that's all I'll say.
That's your answer? Right, so you had 2 more questions. I am never in favor of giving up on any generation. I just, you know, as I said before, folks didn't ask for this. You know, I mean, you have to fight. Even if you think you're going to lose, you have to fight. You know, even if all your analytics say you're going to lose, you just got to fight. You know, you got to look yourself in the mirror, you know, at night before you go to bed. And, you know, I said this earlier today, it's very, very important to me that I look myself in the mirror and not feel like I am amongst those who are trying to push the earth over the ledge. It's important in and of itself, no matter what happens after that. In terms of France, I mean, I think people, let's just, you know, clear something. Like, I didn't go there fleeing racism in America. I didn't have I mean, I had some expectations. I thought I would drink some great wine, eat some good food, and see some art. You know what I mean? I mean, seriously, it's just a place. It's just another place. Do you understand what I'm saying? It is not a, And so I went at a relatively advanced age. I was like 37. So by then, whatever, maybe had I gone at like 21 or 22, I would have felt differently. But at 30, I just, I felt like I was a writer. I felt like writers should, speak other languages, and I did not speak another language. I still don't. I'm working on it, but that's what this year is about. I felt like going this year that I had an ignorance of the world that, again, was very, very much tied to neighborhood, the kind of school I went to, who I was around. I did not want my son to be in that same sort of way. I wanted him to have experiences that I had not had. It was very, very important to me. But it really is just a place. You know what I mean? And it is not immune from the deeply human pattern of erecting societies and states by putting your foot on somebody else's neck. America is my problem because I'm an American. But there's nothing, particularly uniquely evil or wrong. I mean, the way we do it, obviously, is different as it will be in every society, but I think it's very, very important for people to understand that there is no escape. That you will go to another society and you'll just find yourself again,
Hi, I'm Mario Small. I'm actually in the Sociology department here, joining the illustrious colleagues you've talked about a minute ago. First, I want to thank you for taking the work of all of my colleagues and making it, first of all, not just accessible, but also tying it to a historical and literary form that I think is all too rare even in my own field, so thank you for that. I've read your pieces in The Atlantic. I haven't read your book yet, but I had a question for you about a point you made earlier about modulating your communication. You talked about the fact that you're talking here, you sort of speak, and you modulate your behavior for the context. If you were in the streets of Baltimore, you'd be doing something different, et cetera. It's a point that I think a lot of the people of color here, for example, could resonate to, the fact that in different contexts you have to sort of speak multiple languages and so on. I want to talk to you about that same point in the context of your book. The book is also a form of communication. You talked about the fact that you wrote it for your son as a literary form, but in spite of that, there was an audience. You were sort of modulating your communication there for a particular audience. My question for you is sort of, what is that audience? What were you trying to represent to that audience? Why did you think that was important?
I don't really modulate in my writing, and I just realized that. That's why I love it. It's so funny. No, it's not modulated at all. That's me right there, man. I mean, that is more me than me sitting here talking right now. Okay. That is, no, it is so, I was telling somebody about this earlier, that it is so liberating. So somebody said, well, what do you do for self-care? Writing is really hard. I said, no, that is the self-care. That's the self-care, the writing, the ability to sit down and, pursue the truth as you see it, and, write it out. So no, I am shocked by the reception that book has gotten. It is certainly not the reception I expected. It is certainly not, and that has problems in and of itself. It always presented problems in and of itself. But no, that's pretty much me right there.
Thank you. Good answer.
Hi, my name is Anamika. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, and I want to thank you for writing this book. It's completely changed my perspective of how to think about policymaking. And I kind of wanted to bring us there to your text, because I have a question about the future of this country because of what you wrote. So you wrote, there's nothing uniquely evil in these destroyers or even in this moment. They're merely men enforcing the whims of our country, correctly interpreting its heritage and legacy. And then you end that really powerful paragraph to talk about how you must always remember the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. And this really stuck with me because last year we learned about regressions, we learned about economics, we learned about how to make policy, and nothing's really changed over the course of 100 years. What is it going to take to change the system?
Well, I'm hesitant to say nothing's changed. 100 years ago, we were lynching quite a few people in the South. I think that's important. Like, I think one can have a critique of the system, you know what I mean, and still, admit that, some things. In other words, I don't think it takes anything away to say that there has been change, But I think white supremacy is wrong. You understand? Like, I think it's deeply, deeply, deeply wrong. And so doing less of it is still incredibly wrong. And still something should be, to be outraged about, right? And you can admit that there's less of it. You can say that. I have no problem saying that. I don't, think that, like this is the same as, being enslaved in South Carolina in 1840. I don't think that. I would never make that argument. I think it's good that, although I'm about to make the case against myself, I think it's good that in many places, many more places, we can vote, even as that's being rolled back in certain other places. I think what I argue against is the notion of inevitable progress. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I think like that's the difference, that it's somehow destined to be, that it will be. It's not possible to go backwards. That's more of my problem. In terms of what it will take, I mean, in my mind, and again, being very, very aware of what I've heard here from my comments, which I'm going to go home and think about, actually. I'm going to leave here thinking about, well, home's a long way away, but I'll be on the plane to my next place thinking about this. Because I do think it's important to think across dimensions, right? Not work on a particular dimension. But from that perspective, I think it requires a critical mass of people in this country to, give up a real interest. It's important to say that. I'm reading this book on the French Revolution, and it was talking about who patrolled the borders between the peasants and the aristocrats, and it was talking about how the poor aristocrats, more than anyone, were most concerned about the borders because the identity of aristocracy was all they had. See, it was really, really important. That was what distinguished them, those rituals, et cetera. And I could not help make the leap, to here and to think of, and this is speculative right now, I'm still working through this, but to think of whiteness almost as an aristocracy. Do you know what I mean? A system of rights. You understand that if you're born in a certain way, it is less likely that, again, to go back to this, someone will flip your kid over, in a school and drag her across. It's just less likely. It's less likely that you'll face the kind of, violence that I, talk about in the book. You won't live in certain neighborhoods. Your job prospects will be different. All of these sort of issues, come to you just, on the basis, of whiteness. It would require folks saying, okay, we'll give that up. We'll give that up. I think that it.
Yeah, I would just like to weigh in on this. The question is, how do we arouse consciousness and our conscience about the problems we're talking about? Let's focus, for example, on race and poverty. We could just talk about race, where I just mentioned here race and poverty. Now, you talk about reparations as one way to address it. I talk about the redistribution of resources. Now, we both have no illusions that either will be done in this political climate.
Yes, exactly.
Right, precisely. Now, the question is, should we be pessimistic? Should we wallow in pessimism, saying nothing can be done? Or should we hope that eventually we will have the right political climate to start to address some of these issues? And that's why we should begin talking about what ought to be done. We just shouldn't say, well, we don't have the right political climate. We should say, what ought to be done to really comprehensively address the problems we're talking about?
I know for the three of you, none of you take the political climate as given.
No.
And in all your work, I read all of your work as efforts to change that climate. I wonder if each of you could just take 30 seconds to say something about that in your own work. How do we change the climate that allows different policies to be imagined, implemented?
So I can talk a little bit about family policy. I wrote a book, you blogged a little bit about it, called, with Tim Nelson, called Doing the Best I Can, about an 8-year study of non-custodial fathers in the Philadelphia, Camden area, Black, white, and Latino, but the degree to which these men have just been erased. These are unmarried men. They're erased by child support policy. Mothers are given a presumed custody over children. Fathers are put in a debtor's prison of child support with no corresponding rights to their children to make decisions over their children. When you talk to audiences about father's right to parenting time, the first thing you'll hear is that these men are violent and we have to be careful about them, playing a part of their children's lives, just to reinforce your point about how these stereotypes about black men are now sort of spreading to poor men, into men who have children outside of a marital tie. And what I've been advocating for is that poor men who have children outside of a marital tie, should be treated the same way that middle-class men are. Middle-class men actually get divorces, and so their parenting time is adjudicated. And it's absolutely amazing to me how we've encoded all of these prejudices into our child support policy, and how much resistance there is to treating these men with basic human respect. So many of the things you wrote about, and maybe especially the assumption of criminality, have really become encoded into family policy in a way that does far more harm than a mere lack of a marital tie, right? It really drives a wedge between a father and his child.
I think that's so important. I mean, maybe there's an academic discipline that covers this, but I don't know how you measure the impact of repeatedly labeling someone a certain thing over time, and what that does to the political imagination. But I suspect it has some effect. And so, like, for my generation, I was coming up during this period, when folks label you as, super predator, when people use terms like that. I'm not going to say it's responsible, for, our carceral policy, but it at least has some effects. It's at least within a tradition of talking about people a certain way and then going ahead and doing certain things to them. I think about my work, and I was saying this, we were talking about the subsidy. I think about my work as not like, so here is like the realm as they saw, politics is the art of the possible, right? So here's what's possible, right? I feel like as a writer, I have an obligation not to be bound by that, to not write as though I were a Senate aide. A Senate aide is it's a very good thing to aspire to do. I have no problem with Senate aides, but I'm not one. I'm not one. And so if the answer's here, hey, I'll say the answer's here. But if it's way over here, and I have a responsibility to say that, to assemble as much scholarship, as much journalism, as much evidence as I can behind it, and say that. And the hope of what happens is that over the long term, and this is generational, I think. I don't think this is like my lifetime, but over the long term, maybe things open up a little bit more. I was thinking, we were talking about that, and I think it's always worth remembering. 1859, Frederick Douglass, abolitionist, is saying, right thing to do is right now free all the 4 million enslaved black people in the South. And no one thought that would happen. Everyone thought that was crazy. 6 years later, proved to be right. Diva was talking about how in 2004, Bush is running an anti-marriage equality platform. That's helping him get elected. And look where we are now. Now, that doesn't mean that I expect, same thing to happen for reparations, but you don't know. You don't know. And so I think, like, as Bill was saying, like the notion that you should only say, things that are within here as opposed to where we are to be, I just think is really, really important.
Should I just respond?
Yeah.
I concur. I just want to say, Bruce, I'm glad you asked that question, because I would like to say that, Bruce and I and Rob and Matt and Mario and Diva are involved in a very comprehensive research project. We're launching it on race and poverty through Henry Louis Gates' center, the Hutchins Center here at Harvard. And we not only hope that we can come up with comprehensive findings, new findings that would enhance our understanding of race and poverty, but we're establishing connections, when I won't mention any names, but we're establishing connection with some powerful institutions and organizations in this country that will help us translate our findings and reach a broader audience, including policymakers. And I'm very excited about that.
I think that's the definition of a teaser, right? That is. We have time for one last question from the floor.
Hi, my name is Alan. I'm a senior at the college. I write for the Harvard Crimson. I was just really interested in your opinion as a journalist, as an author. A lot of the discussions that we've been having about race recently have been sort of, I don't want to say sidetracked, but they've been tied to discussions about free speech and free press. And I think some of your colleagues at The Atlantic have argued both sides, saying that it is a good thing, it's a distraction. I was wondering what your thought was on that.
Can you be like specific? Are you asking me about trigger? Like this, I just want you to, because free speech is such a big thing.
Okay, yeah. So I think this relates to the Yale issue. I think it relates to an issue that happened at Wesleyan and a lot of other college campuses where I think people have said certain things that have been deemed offensive and have been tried to be held accountable for. I think it goes to the Christakis email. But there's a rising discussion about not the content of the speech, but should this person have been allowed to say that, period. And I think opponents have said, well, that ignores the whole issue of systemic racism and marginalization of colored people's voices. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that, being a journalist.
Yeah, no, again, you know, I'm not as up on this as I should, but I do think I have some context. I think, again, like we are accounting for things, like it's, you know what okay, so you're saying, you know, I want to dress in blackface. Why is this not my free speech issue for Halloween, for instance? You know, why are you so, you know, tender and offended by this, right? But again, I think like in these cases, like we're like 5 questions too late. You know, by the time that has become important, something else has really, really gone wrong. And so much, I don't know why it's this way. I mean, I guess this is just what we have, you know? But see, like you have to back that up. So, okay, so why does blackface offend you? You know what I mean? Well, you know, it's used to degrade black folks and make them feel a certain way. Well, for what purpose? Because X, Y, and Z happened. But if we, you know, lived in a society in which white supremacy actually did not, you know, exist as a functional force, if we did not actually have that in our lives, maybe we would not care. Do you know what I mean? Like all of that context is sort of gone, and you end up arguing in this really, really, really confined space. I obviously support free speech. You know, I think free speech is a good thing. I'm not, and this is just individual, right? This is not a statement on like other folks. I think this is like a product of me growing up where I grew up and then going to Howard. Boy, this is horrible. I don't particularly get, you know, like upset about, you know, students wearing blackface and that sort of thing. I certainly don't support it, but it's like, listen, among certain, I'm just gonna be really honest with you, among certain populations, you know, within the African American community, and I'll just say, you know, for myself, and I'm not coming out and saying this because I think, you know, I'm in the midst of evolution on this myself, you just have low expectations for white people. I mean, there's no other way to say that. You really do, and so it's like, no, but because I mean, y'all are laughing, but it's really not funny because nobody wants to be that way, and nobody should be that way, and I mean, it's actually been an education I've had on this book. You know, as I've gone out and talked on folks, I don't even know that it's like a correct, but it's almost like a way of shielding yourself. And you say, well, that's who they are anyway. What'd you expect? You know, and so, see, the kids that go to Yale and protest that, they have expectations. And in that sense, they're kind of right. Do you understand? They actually are kind of right in some sort of, you know, profound way. Whereas me, you know, I probably would just, you know, walk past, listen, I'll be out of here in 4 years. I don't care about this institution anyway. Like, that would be my mindset, but that's not correct. Do you understand? Yeah. That's not correct because you should have the right to belong to the institution just like anybody else. You should feel just as at home in the institution as anybody else, you know? So that's a long, rambling answer. Like I said, I haven't had the chance to digest it like I should to give you, you know, a more coherent, you know, intelligent answer.
Thank you.
That's my own professor from Howard. He's my own Howard University professor. This is a story.
Brilliant.
This is my, So hilarious. I didn't know you were going to be here. This is my professor, Linda Haywood. I had her at Howard University for history. She is... more than any other professor I had Dr. Haywood for Black Diaspora 1, Black Diaspora 2, and Central Africa, where she broke my heart. I mean, she really, because I came in as a fairly fervent Black nationalist, Afrocentrist, and she just wasn't having it. I mean, everything was, she used to say, you bring your evidence and I'll bring mine. Where's your journal article? Because I got like 5 of them right here. And she taught me how to think, so that's why she's yelling from the floor.
So, very sadly, we're over time, and we have to bring this conversation to a close. I thought this was a brilliant panel. I want to thank you, Ta-Nehisi, for sharing your time with us and engaging in this conversation. I want to thank Bill Wilson and Kathryn Edin for their wisdom. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.